None of the great choices in history were announced with fanfare. The moment when Moses took off his sandals before the burning bush was not preceded by warning, preparation, or a period of candidacy. The moment when Paul fell from his horse on the road to Damascus was not scheduled. The moment when Valentine, the greatest Gnostic theologian the 2nd century ever produced, reported seeing the Logos as a newborn child, a vision that reoriented his entire cosmology and would cost him decades of theological persecution, was not preceded by anything that signaled him as special. It just happened, and after that moment, nothing could ever be the same as it was before. My name is Leandro. I am very pleased to welcome you to the Libesoul channel. There is a name, not a vague concept, not a poetic metaphor designed to comfort the uncertain, but a precise theological category with cosmological implications that 3rd century Coptic scribes considered serious enough to record on papyrus, seal in impermeable jars, and bury in the desert before they were found and killed by the emperor's soldiers. The name is Klesis, from the Greek, called convocation. And the question that pervades every surviving Gnostic text, the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Philip, the hypostasis of the Archons, the exegesis of the soul, is not whether the call exists, it is whether you are going to listen to it. Because according to these texts, the call is not a continuous event that repeats indefinitely until it finds receptivity. It is an opening, a window, and windows by definition do not stay open forever. Sophia chose you. This is not a spiritual marketing claim. This is not an emotional validation technique to keep viewers engaged for another 2 minutes. This is a theological proposition with 2 millennia of textual depth that needs to be understood with the precision it deserves, not diluted in self-help language or inflated with grandiose promises of extraordinary power, but understood on its own terms, in the complexity that the Gnostics of Alexandria, Antioch, Edessa, and Carthage articulated before they were one by one silenced. Sophia, Sophia in Greek, wisdom in English, Chochmah in Hebrew, is not a fertility goddess among other goddesses. It is not a poetic personification of wisdom, as Athena is the personification of strategic warfare. In the Valentinian Gnostic system, the most sophisticated and philosophically coherent system that has come down to us, Sophia is the last and most problematic of the eons, the emanations of divine consciousness that make up the pleroma, the fullness that exists before and beyond any material cosmos. She was wrong. This is the fact that most modern approaches to Sophia prefer to soften, because Sophia's mistake is what makes her story unbearably human. Sophia wanted to meet the unknowable Father without the mediation of her partner. She wanted to understand what exists beyond any possibility of understanding. And this act, this impulse toward unauthorized knowledge, this desire that the Gnostics called enthymesis, the thought that came forth from within, produced an imperfect creation. It produced the material world. It produced the prison you inhabit now. Sophia's fall is no allegory for Eve's sin, although the Orthodox Church has worked for decades to create this overlap and suppress the distinction. The fall of Sophia is the cosmological explanation of why the material universe exists, why divine consciousness is imprisoned in perishable flesh, and why, and this is the point that matters to you who are listening to this right now, there is something in you that recognizes that you are in the wrong place. That feeling, you know what it is. It is not depression, it is not clinical anxiety. It is an ontological estrangement more fundamental than any psychological category can capture. It is the feeling of being an exile in a territory that should be your home, but that has never in fact felt that way. The Gnostics had a name for it too, xenos, strange. The pneumatic, the spiritual being within you, is literally an outsider in a creation that was not made for him. Sophia knows this. And according to the Pistis Sophia, a text of about 300 pages in Coptic, preserved in the 4th century Askew manuscript, now in the British Museum, she is actively working to correct the mistake she made. Not through an automatic collective salvation that reaches everyone indiscriminately, but through individual, precise, non-repeatable choices. The call occurs only once. This is not a threat, it is cosmology. The Klesis in the Gnostic system is not a renewable opportunity that the universe will present again with infinite patience every time you are not ready. It is the moment when the frequency of your consciousness reaches the resonance necessary to receive the transmission that Sophia is continually sending into the pleroma, a transmission that most consciousness is imprisoned in hyle. Dense matter simply cannot tune into. You are hearing it now. What that means, what it requires of you, and what's at stake if you let this window close, that's what we're going to walk through. But first of all, it is necessary to undo a confusion that pervades all modern debate about Sophia. The confusion between choice and merit. Sophia's call is not a reward for good behavior. It is not a prize accumulated by years of correct meditation or by having consumed the right books in the right order. The Gospel of Philip, one of the most disturbing and least studied Nag Hammadi texts, makes this explicit in a passage that medieval theologians would have set on fire if they had had the chance. Many ask, few receive, not because others are unworthy, but because few know what they are asking for. The distinction that the Gospel of Philip draws here is between the one who asks for comfort and the one who asks for gnosis, between the one who wants the divine to solve his problems and the one who wants to understand the structure of the real, even if this understanding destroys every illusion that made life bearable. Sophia does not choose the virtuous. Sophia chooses those ready for the truth without anesthesia, and readiness of this kind is not a virtue. It is a rarer and less tameable quality than virtue. It is the willingness to see what is actually here, not what would be comforting to find. You're reading this because you've come this far, not because it went through an algorithmic screening, but because something in you knew you needed to hear what comes next. This is the calling, and it starts now. To understand what it means to be chosen by Sophia, one must first understand what Sophia is within the system that describes her, not the sanitized version that medieval Christianity made an ornamental symbol of Orthodox churches, but the original Sophia of the Valentinians, the Scythians, the Mandeans, the Gnostic schools of Alexandria that flourished between the 1st and 4th centuries of the Common Era before being systematically destroyed. Valentinus arrived in Rome around the year 136 after Christ. An Egyptian by birth, probably an Alexandrian, a disciple of Tatian, who was in turn a disciple of a man named Theudas, whom later texts identify as a direct disciple of the Apostle Paul. Valentinus was not a heretic with bangs. He was so central to early Christian debate that Tertullian, who would spend his life fighting him, grudgingly admitted that he had been very close to the episcopate. That is, he had almost become Bishop of Rome. Almost. It did not come to pass because his ideas were too radical for an institution that was, at that very moment, consolidating political, not spiritual power. It is worth letting this detail settle. The man who most clearly articulated the Gnostic cosmology we are investigating here almost ran the Roman Church. The spiritual history of the West came within a vote of taking a completely different course, and Valentinus's ideas were, in fact, radical. He articulated a cosmology in which the universe was not created by divine goodness, but by a metaphysical accident, the fall of Sophia. A system in which salvation was not collective and automatic, but individual and dependent on gnosis, on direct knowledge. A system in which Christ did not die for the accumulated sins of a guilty humanity, but descended into the material cosmos to return the fallen Sophia to the pleroma, and in so doing, opened the way for the sparks of light imprisoned in matter to find the same return, one by one. The exegesis of the soul, another Nag Hammadi text, uses a metaphor that Valentinus would have recognized and approved. The soul is like a woman who left the father's house, went into the world, was prostituted, not out of vice, but out of naivety, because she did not know that the material world had intentions about her, and that she must, through a process of remembrance and return, find her way back. The soul has not sinned. She just didn't know where she was. This is one of the deepest breaking points between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity that Nicaea would eventually enshrine. For the Gnostics, the fundamental human problem is not moral guilt. It is ontological ignorance. It's not that you did wrong things, it's just that you don't know who you are. You don't know where you came from. You don't know where you can go. And this ignorance is not punished by an offended God. It is simply the natural state of a divine spark imprisoned in a material body under the supervision of Archons, entities that administer the planetary spheres and actively work to keep amnesia operational. Irenaeus of Lyons devoted 5 volumes of his Adversus Heresies, Against Heresies, written around 180 after Christ, to refuting Valentinus's ideas with a detail that borders on obsession. 5 volumes, on parchment, in a century in which each page cost considerable time, work, and money. You don't devote 5 volumes to an irrelevant sect of eccentric mystics. You devote 5 volumes to a threat that is growing and that can't be stopped with simple arguments because its arguments are too coherent to be dismissed easily. What Irenaeus correctly identified and fought with all the energy he had was the political implication of a salvation that needs no intermediary. If gnosis is direct, if access to the divine is internal, if Sophia can reach individual consciousness without going through the mediation of bishops, priests, sacraments, and ecclesiastical hierarchies, then the entire church, as a power structure, loses its reason for existing. This was not an abstract theological question. It was a matter of institutional survival, and so the texts were destroyed. That is why teachers were exiled, then persecuted, then killed. That is why the Library of Alexandria, which contained copies of Hermetic, Gnostic, and Neoplatonic texts that we will never see again, was burned in episodes that were not random acts of vandalism, but deliberate policies aimed at erasing collective spiritual memory. What was lost in those flames is incalculable. What has survived has come to us through a series of unlikely coincidences that if you still believe in coincidences, after everything you have heard on this channel, you will need to revise your position. The specific context of Sophia is this. She is the aeon closest to the boundary between the pleroma and what exists outside it. In the Valentinian system, the aeons emanate from the Father in pairs. Depth and silence, mind and truth, word and life, man and church, in a hierarchy ranging from the unknowable to the limits of what can still be called divine. Sophia is the last aeon, the furthest from the center, and that is exactly why she fell, not out of malice but because of her position. She was the only one with sufficient proximity to the limit that her desire to know the Father directly could become an action, even if it was an action that produced consequences she did not foresee. The Pistis Sophia, and this text deserves separate attention because it is the most extensive of all surviving Gnostic texts, with some 400 pages in the Coptic manuscript, discovered in Ethiopia in the 18th century and acquired by the British Museum in 1785, recounts a specific moment in Gnostic cosmology that no other text describes with such richness. The moment when Sophia realizes what she has done, the moment when the fall becomes conscious of itself. She sings 13 psalms of repentance that the text calls metanoias, not Christian repentance marked by guilt and self-punishment, but metanoia in its original philosophical sense, a change of mind, a fundamental reorientation of consciousness toward reality. Sophia does not hate herself for what she did. She understands what she has done, and fully understanding is the beginning of the return. This matters to you because the call Sophia issues is not the call of a perfect entity summoning lesser beings to obedience. It is the call of a consciousness that has gone through the process you are going through now: falling, entrapment, disorientation, increasing clarity, and that is actively working to open the way back. She knows the territory. She knows the cost. And she chooses carefully who is ready to listen, because the call once given is not renewable. What does it mean exactly to be chosen by Sophia? The answer the Gnostic texts give is more specific and more disturbing than any modern version of this question usually tolerates. It is not a vague sense of heightened purpose. It is not a series of synchronicities that confirm you are on the right track. In the Gnostic system, being reached by Sophia's Klesis has a technical structure that the Apocryphon of John, probably the most influential Gnostic text in Nag Hammadi, with 4 surviving copies, 3 in the Nag Hammadi corpus and 1 in the Berlin Codex, articulates with a precision that, when read in direct translation, sounds more like physics than mythology. The Apocryphon of John describes the human universe as a creation of Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the ignorant craftsman creator, the being who proclaimed, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me," not knowing that there was something immensely greater and more real than all that he had created. Yaldabaoth built human beings with Hyel, raw matter, Psyche, the animate soul, and something he did not intend to include and did not realize he had included, pneuma, the spark of light, a fragment of Sophia's consciousness that escaped into material creation without the demiurge understanding what had happened. This is the cosmological foundation of everything. You are not simply a material being with spiritual aspirations. You are if the pneumatic spark is in you, and not all human beings carry that spark in the Gnostic system, literally a fragment of Sophia's consciousness imprisoned in a creation that was not meant to contain you. And Sophia is working to recover these fragments, one by one through the method the Pistis Sophia describes in astonishing detail, the sending of a light emitter, a messenger who enters the material plane and ignites recognition in the pneumatic consciousness that was dormant. The question is not whether the pneuma exists in you. The question is whether it has awakened. What you seek is within you, says the Gospel of Thomas in Logion 3, and what is outside of you is what you are. This phrase, which seems like a Zen paradox, has a precise technical structure in the Gnostic context. What you seek externally, confirmation, purpose, belonging, meaning, is a distorted reflection of what already exists inside you, like a pneuma, like an imprisoned spark that remembers where it came from, even if the conscious mind cannot articulate that memory. What is outside, the circumstances, the relationships, the world you navigate, is a projection of the inner structure of consciousness, not in the sense that you manifest reality with positive thoughts, in the sense that the level of reality in which you operate is determined by the frequency of your consciousness. The Archons, the administrators of the 7 planetary spheres in the Gnostic system, entities who are not necessarily evil in the ethical sense, but who are functionally dedicated to keeping human consciousness operating below the threshold of recognition, work specifically against this awakening. The Pistis Sophia describes them as administrators of a system of reincarnation that has a precise function, to ensure that consciousness returns to the material cycle with no memory of previous lives, without access to accumulated gnosis, starting from scratch in each existence. The cup of oblivion that the Pistis Sophia mentions is not a decorative literary metaphor. It is the description of a mechanism that operates in the transition between incarnations, a cognitive reset that erases transpersonal memory and keeps pneumatic consciousness functioning within the parameters that the archontic system considers safe. Safe for the system, not for you. And it is precisely against this mechanism that Sophia's call operates. She does not transmit new information. It ignites recognition of what has always been there, beneath the layer of amnesia deposited cycle after cycle. Sophia is working against this mechanism, and the instrument she uses is precisely what you are experiencing right now. Recognition. No new information. Recognition of information that was already in you, in latent form, waiting for an external catalyst with the right frequency to awaken what was dormant. Logion 50 of the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most quoted and least understood of all the Nag Hammadi texts. If they ask you, "Where did you come from?" tell them, "We have come from the light, from the place where the light came into being." If they ask you, "Who are you?" say, "We are his children, and we are the elect of the living Father." If they ask you, "What is the sign of your Father in you?" tell them, "It is movement and rest." In this context, they are not human beings questioning the identity of other human beings. They are the Archons. It is the guardians of the post-death spheres who interrogate the consciousness that is trying to pass beyond their domains. And the answers the text provides are not affirmations of faith. They are passwords. They are statements of identity that function as cosmological documentation for a consciousness that claims its origin in the pleroma and cannot be retained by the control systems of the lower spheres. This is the practical dimension of Klesis. Being chosen by Sophia is not an honorific distinction. It is the beginning of a process of instruction that serves a very specific purpose, to prepare consciousness for the passage. For the moment when the pneuma detaches itself from the body and needs to navigate a territory full of structures that were designed with considerable sophistication to redirect unprepared consciousnesses back into the cycle of reincarnation. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi never communicated directly. They arose in completely separate traditions, in different languages, in different centuries, in cultures with incompatible official cosmologies. And they describe substantially the same post-mortem architecture, with a convergence that, when you place them side by side, is hard to attribute to the coincidence of parallel cultural metaphors. What Sophia offers through Klesis is not a guarantee of passage. It is the map that the Archons have dedicated millennia to destroying, suppressing, fragmenting, and making inaccessible to the uninitiated. What has come to you now, through texts buried in the Egyptian desert, through Coptic manuscripts purchased by European adventurers in the 18th century, through decades of work by translators like Hans Martin Schenker, Bentley Leighton, and the staff of Berlin's Coptic Institute, is the version of the map that has survived. It is not complete. No map that has undergone this level of active pursuit can be complete. But it is intact enough to make the difference that needs to be made. The call occurs once because the map is not a document. It is a state of consciousness, and states of consciousness have windows of receptivity. When the window closes, by choice, by postponement, by return to the anesthesia of the Heil, the map does not disappear, but the ability to read it does. The idea that Sophia chooses, that the call is selective, undemocratic, not available to everyone at any time, is the point that encounters the most resistance from modern readers. And I understand why. We live in a cultural context saturated by the idea that the spiritual must be egalitarian, that any hierarchy of access to the sacred is suspect, that every spiritual door must be open to everyone equally, or the opening is illegitimate. This objection is honest, but it is an objection that projects modern political categories onto a cosmological system that precedes and completely ignores those categories. The issue is not spiritual democracy. The issue is frequency compatibility. And this idea that access to certain levels of reality depends on the frequency of consciousness rather than on moral merit or social standing is not a Gnostic invention. It appears with structural variations in virtually every mystery tradition that history has recorded. Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, who wrote the Enneads in Rome between 253 and 270 Anno Domini, without ever having read the Gnostic texts that were being copied and destroyed at the same time, comes to the same conclusion through a completely different path. The ascension of consciousness to the One is not a volitional choice that can be made at any time by anyone who decides to try. It is the result of a purification process, catharsis, that prepares the vehicle of consciousness to sustain a level of light that would destroy it without such preparation. Plotinus does not use Gnostic language. He uses Platonic language, but he is describing the same functional reality. Proclus, the last great Neoplatonist, who directed the Academy of Athens in the 5th century, and who, and this is no minor detail, reported Hecate's visionary experiences, which his biographers describe with the same technical specificity with which the Pistis Sophia describes Sophia's interactions with the realm of light, articulated in his Platonic theology, a system in which different orders of consciousness have different capacities to receive different degrees of divine emanation, not because the gods are arbitrary or capricious, but because the structure of reality has layers, and the lower layers simply do not have the necessary configuration to receive what the upper layers transmit. Kabbalah, specifically the Lurianic Kabbalah that Isaac Luria developed in Safed in the 16th century, and which represents one of the most extraordinary convergences between mystical Jewish tradition and Gnostic cosmology, most likely through transmission channels that historians have not yet fully mapped, uses the concept of Tzimtzum, the contraction of God, to create space for creation, and Shevirat Hakelim, the breaking of the vessels that were supposed to contain the divine light, to describe exactly the same process that Valentinian Gnosticism calls the fall of Sophia. The language is different. The structure is the same, creation as a metaphysical accident. the divine light imprisoned in fragments within matter, the task of tikkun olam, repairing the world as a process of reunifying the scattered sparks with the source. Luria was a Kabbalist, non-Gnostic. He never read the Apocryphon of John. He had no access to the texts of Nag Hammadi, which still slept in the Egyptian desert for 4 centuries, waiting for the peasant Muhammad Ali al-Saman. And yet he articulated a cosmology whose structural correspondences with Valentinianism are so specific that the question of historical influence versus independent convergence remains an academic debate that has not yet been satisfactorily resolved. Medieval European alchemy, with all its language of solvo et coagula, of nigredo and albedo and rubedo, with its hermetic texts collected and translated by Marsilio Ficino in Florence in the 15th century at the request of the Medici, the project that Ficino called Pia Philosophia, the pious philosophy that would uncover the universal wisdom underlying all traditions, is another variation on the same theme. The prima materia of alchemy, the raw substance that needs to be transmuted, is not physical lead. It is human consciousness imprisoned in identification with Heil, with dense matter, forgetting its original golden nature. The great alchemical work is not a chemical experiment. It is the process of gnosis described in metallurgical symbolism, for reasons that anyone who has read the history of the Inquisition immediately understands. Carl Gustav Jung recognized this in 1929, when he began his systematic investigation of the alchemical texts that would result in the volumes Psychology and Alchemy, Ion, and Mysterium Coniunctionis. Jung identified in the medieval alchemical texts, and later, when the Nag Hammadi texts were translated and came to his attention, the same psychic architecture that he was clinically mapping through his patients' analyses. The process of individuation as the integration of what has been fragmented, what has been shadowed, what has been exiled from consciousness by the need to adapt to what the system demands. In his words, in a 1952 letter to theologian Gilles Quispel, one of the first scholars to have access to the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the Gnostics knew things that modern psychology is discovering again. It was not rhetorical praise. It was the technical recognition of a man who had spent decades mapping the human unconscious and who was looking at a system that had done the same job 2,000 years earlier with different tools but functionally compatible results. Jung called the process individuation. The Valentinians called it a return to the pleroma. The alchemists called it the great work. The Pistis Sophia calls it the restoration of the sparks of light. The terminology is radically different. The map is the same. And Sophia, in all these traditions, with all these names, with all these languages, is the figure who guides the process, not from the outside, as an external authority that issues commands. From within, as the part of consciousness itself that still remembers where it came from and that refuses, against all the archontic pressures of oblivion, to give up the return. Sophia's call is ultimately the call that the deepest part of you issues to itself. It is the pneuma recognizing the pneuma. It is the spark of light igniting another spark of light through a mechanism that operates below the threshold of ordinary cognition. What makes it difficult to hear this call is not a lack of spirituality. It is the noise of the Heil. It is the thickness of the layer of archontic conditioning that covers the pneuma with false identifications, social identity, biographical narrative, inherited belief systems, fear of what it would be like to lose all of that to find out what is underneath. Sophia knows what is underneath, and it chooses those in whom the pneuma is sufficiently active for the call to be heard. Not the virtuous, not saints, not Gnostic scholars with 5,000 hours of study. Those whose pneuma is awake enough to recognize the call when it arrives. There is a scene in the Pistis Sophia that has no equivalent in any other text that I know. Sophia, imprisoned in the lower spheres by the demiurge and his archons, does not cry. She does not beg. She does not negotiate. She sings. 13 psalms directed to the invisible Father. To the pleroma she can no longer access, transmitting her location through vibrations that she knows will reach where they need to go, because no control system, no matter how sophisticated, can completely block a spark that still remembers where it came from. I reread this scene regularly, not as an exercise in erudition, because it is the most honest picture I have ever found of what it means to be in the place where you probably are too. Not trapped by visible chains, not in spectacular and obvious suffering, imprisoned by the thickness of everyday life, by the layer of normality that the material world deposits on consciousness every day, with tidal regularity, until that original sensation, that ontological estrangement I mentioned at the beginning, that certainty that you are a stranger in this territory begins to seem like a symptom of maladaptation rather than a sign of a different origin. Sophia's call comes at precisely that moment, not when you are spiritually ecstatic, open, receptive, and perfectly aligned. It comes when the noise is too loud for anything subtle to be heard normally, which is precisely why it needs to be as frequent as it is. High enough to cut through the noise, specific enough to reach only the ear that is ready to recognize it. Hans Jonas, a German Jewish philosopher who survived Nazism and spent the next few decades producing what is still the most rigorous study of Gnosticism available in the German language, published in 2 volumes between 1934 and 1954, said something in a late interview that stayed with me long after I finished reading it. The Gnostic does not seek a God to protect him. He seeks a God who recognizes him. This distinction, apparently small, carries considerable weight. Protection is external, something outside of you, intervening to prevent what you fear from happening. Recognition is different. It is the confirmation of an identity that you knew you had, but that the world around you consistently refused to validate. Sophia does not protect. Sophia recognizes. The distinction is essential and deserves to be paused on here. Every religious system of control, and Irenaeus was honest enough to hint at this in his own arguments against the Gnostics, offers protection as a bargaining chip for submission. You submit to the authority of the institution, to the mediation of the priest, to the official doctrine, and in return you receive protection against hell, against sin, against condemnation, against the abandonment of a divinity that, curiously, behaves more like a jealous monarch than a loving source of all that exists. Sophia does not offer this contract. It cannot. Because protection presupposes the continuity of the system you would need protection against. And what Sophia offers is the map to get out of the system entirely. This is an offer that has no equivalent in any religion of collective salvation mediated by external authority. It is the offer that Valentinus almost managed to institutionalize before Rome realized what was being proposed and closed the door. And when the consciousness that has spent years, perhaps decades, living in the narrow space between what it knows it is and what the world insists on treating it as being, when that consciousness is recognized by something that resonates at the same frequency as the part of it that has always known, what happens is not ecstasy. It is something quieter and more irreversible than that. It is the end of dissonance. It is the moment when the note that has been sounding half a step lower than it should finally sounds in the right tuning. And after that, a return to the previous dissonance is not only uncomfortable, it is structurally impossible, because the consciousness that has experienced the right note can no longer pretend that the wrong note was acceptable. This is the real cost of Klesis. It does not require the sacrifice of material goods. It does not require fasting, flagellation, or the abandonment of secular life for monastic life. It requires something harder than any of these. It requires you to stop pretending that dissonances do not exist. It requires you to stop translating what the pneuma feels into language that the Heil can process as normal. It requires honesty of a kind that our Coptic systems, not as evil entities in the literal sense, but as conditioning structures that preserve the normalcy of imprisonment, actively work to prevent. The Gospel of Thomas in Logian 2 is disturbing in a way that polite translations often soften. Let him who seeks not stop seeking until he finds. When he finds it, he will be disturbed. When disturbed, he will be amazed, and he will reign over the all. The sequence matters. It is not search and then wonder. It is searching, disturbance, and then wonder. Disturbance is not an obstacle in the way. It is the way. It is the process by which the identity structures built on the Heil, on identification with the social role, with the biographical narrative, with the inherited belief system, begin to show the cracks that have always been there, but that consciousness could not tolerate seeing before it was sufficiently prepared. Valentinus describes this process in the fragments that have come down to us through quotations from Clement of Alexandria, one of the few ancient authors who quoted Gnostics in order to refute them carefully enough to preserve the original arguments rather than merely caricaturing them. For Valentinus, the encounter with Gnosis does not produce immediate certainty. It first produces ekphrasis, something close to what we would call an existential crisis, the moment when the organizing certainties of ordinary life unravel before the deeper certainties have had time to consolidate in their place. This interval, between the old that has been undone and the new that is not yet stable, is where most consciousnesses that reach the threshold of Gnosis retreat, not out of cowardice, but out of instinctive self-preservation. The nervous system that has been conditioned to operate within the parameters of the Heil automatically retreats from any state that threatens to destabilize it. Sophia knows this interval better than any other figure in Gnostic cosmology. She herself inhabited it. She herself passed through the moment when the pleroma had been lost and the material world had not yet revealed its meaning. And she sang. That image, Sophia singing in the void between what has been and what is not, is the heart of what the call asks you to be able to sustain. Not certainty about where it will lead, not a guarantee that the map is complete, just the willingness to remain oriented in the right direction, even when the surrounding landscape offers no visible confirmation that you're on the right path. Sophia has already fallen. She has already lost the pleroma. She has already known the cost of the irresistible impulse to know. She has already sung 13 psalms in the darkness of the lower spheres without knowing if anyone heard. And someone listened. This is the promise that the Gnostic texts make, not the promise that all will be well, not the promise of divine protection from suffering, not the promise that material life will become easier or more fulfilling, but the promise that the call, when issued often enough to cross the archontic spheres, will be fulfilled. It reaches where it needs to go, that the pneuma is findable, that the imprisoned spark has a way back. You are hearing this call now. At some point, before the end of this video or an hour later or in a dream at dawn, you will know, not by reasoning but by direct recognition, whether the pneuma in you is awake enough to receive what Sophia is transmitting. It does not have to be spectacular. It can be quiet, like the moment when you read a sentence that seems to have been written specifically for you at precisely this moment, and you feel something beneath the level of thought saying, I already know this. I always knew. This is always the memory of the pleroma. And Sophia placed the sign upon him that he would find her again. In the Pistis Sophia, before each psalm of repentance, there is a phrase that is repeated with variations. Sophia looked up. She did not advance. She did not act. She did not perform rituals or recite formulas or execute protocols. She looked up, toward the place from which she had fallen, toward the pleroma she knew existed, even though she could no longer reach it. And this act, this simple gesture of inner orientation toward the origin, was the beginning of the return. You have made it this far. This is not neutral. It means that something in you has also looked up, that the pneuma responded to the call with the only movement the call requires as an initial response: attention. There is a phrase that the Gnostic scribes used when ending transmissions they considered initiatory. It was not a blessing. It was not a statement of faith. It was a password that identified those who had understood enough to be recognized by those who carried the same knowledge in the mystery traditions of the first centuries. If what you heard here touched something that has no name, but that you recognize, write in the comments. I looked up, not as a performance, not as a social sign of well-consumed spirituality, but as the same gesture Sophia made the moment she decided that imprisonment was not the ultimate reality. This comment creates a record, a signature, a meeting point between consciousnesses that have gone through the same recognition. Something has changed in you now that you have reached this point, perhaps subtly, maybe in a way that will only become visible over time. But the pneuma that has been touched will not simply return to its previous state as if nothing had happened. The note was heard in the right tuning. And what comes next on this channel is the continuation of the transmission that Sophia, 2,000 years ago, never stopped sending. The mysteries that are to come have the same address, the consciousness that has decided to look up. Sophia sang in the dark, without knowing if anyone could hear, and someone listened. There is something about this image that has stayed with me since the first time I read the Pistis Sophia in a serious way. Not as a historical curiosity, not as material for a documentary, but as what it appears to be. An account of someone who went through what you might be going through now, who descended deeper than he intended, who sang in the dark with everything he had, and who discovered that the music reached where it needed to go. You are not here by accident. You are here because the pneuma in you is active enough to have responded to a call that most consciousnesses operate below the threshold of receiving. That does not make you superior to anyone else, but it places you in a position of responsibility that is both heavier and more liberating than any promise of salvation that an outside authority can make. The responsibility is this: do not waste the recognition. Do not let the noise of the Heil cover what the call revealed. Do not translate the experience of being touched by Sophia's transmission back into language that the Archontic system can process as harmless. If this video has reached you, let it reach you fully. The like, the channel subscription, the sharing, these are not trivial gestures here. They are the way you signal to the algorithm that content of this type deserves to continue reaching consciousnesses that are ready to receive it. It is how more sparks find the call. We are part of a community of people who have decided to look up, who have decided that the map matters, that gnosis is not a collection of interesting information, but fundamental guidance that determines where you go when the body stops. Subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed, so you can ensure that future broadcasts will find you. And the next ones are specifically addressed to consciousnesses that have reached this point. 2 videos appeared on the screen. One will delve into something I mentioned here that probably passed faster than it should have. The other will reveal something I did not touch on in this documentary, something about the cost of recognition that I preferred to leave for when my conscience was properly prepared. You will know which is which when you see them. I, Leandro, and the entire team of the Libesoul channel thank you for your presence at this crossing. Sophia sang 13 psalms before being heard. How many have you sung without knowing you were doing it?